All my life, I've always tried to give myself room to change. I think I tend to move through things very often. So, move through ways of thinking, move through social groups, move through countries. And I think in a way that's kind of defined how I think also as an artist. And allowing myself to sort of disengage and progress into a different sphere, whether that's physically or mentally or emotionally, for me has always been very important.
How do you realize that you're moving forward?
It's not necessarily moving forward sometimes. I don't quite know if it's progress, maybe is not the right word, but I do get this kind of itch that I need to do something different. I don't know if it's like a boredom or just a feeling like something is concluding, and then I know that it's time to go.
How did you come to sculpture?
I came to sculpture through painting. So I got into art school on a painting portfolio. And then luckily I went to England, and there they make you try a bit of everything the first year. And when I tried sculpture, I just knew that that was what I had to do. I think with painting, I get very stuck in my head because I'm just sitting looking at a surface. So I get very stuck into an internal conversation. Whereas with sculpture, in my first experience, I was like, I can't afford materials. So my professor said, you should go and look in people's trash. So just that activity of going out into the street at night and going on trash day when people threw away things and just collecting trash and engaging my body and carrying heavy things was already like a really important shift for me. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do.
About painting, it was a conversation. About sculpture, what was it?
I think with painting, I felt too much like it was more of a monologue, or maybe too similar to just thinking about things. That
A mental conversation.
Yeah, it became too mental, too cerebral. And I think with sculpture, because you're dealing with creating a volume in space with your body, and therefore immediately you're having a dialogue because you're using a form that has agency, right, the human body, to create another form. So there's already this like strange transference of physicality that happens in the process that for me was really, really fascinating and kind of has dictated a lot of what I do. A lot of my work deals with the human body, and I'm using it as a way to explore how the human body handles space and time and also expresses agency through that. So a lot of my work has involved literally measuring my capacity as a person, as a body, and kind of using myself as a prototype or a template. So, how far can I reach? How much space do I need to take up? So just things that are, to me, very basic measurements of kind of establishing and situating myself in space and time has kind of been how I've started to produce this work. But then it's also starting to expand now. So I'm starting to sort of mimic others and kind of explore the social-political dimensions of how human bodies take up space. And I don't mean like if you're fat or thin. What I mean is you need to occupy physical space in order to exist. And therefore, you're immediately political. So you're immediately taking space away from something else that could take up that space.
What is your feeling? What is your first feeling when you start working on a piece?
I think the first feeling is a curiosity. So I'm not going to do something if I know exactly what the outcome is going to be. Like I don't work that way where I have an image in my head and I'm just going to make it. I usually start with a question. For example, is there certain geometries that are natural to a human body? So I start to try and experiment with that. And that usually involves me standing in front of a wall with pencils and doing big drawings that look kind of silly, and I don't show them or anything, but I'll just move through space with pencils and kind of try and draw around myself and just understand sort of the answer to these questions using my body. So I, start to understand how far can I reach? What are my limits? What do I need? What can I do? So those kinds of questions are the basic building blocks. And then I respond to it with very specific movements that then slowly consolidate into something that's like a choreography.
What about the size, the scale, and the material? How do you choose them to work on?
I initially was attracted to materials that I could get very, very cheaply. So I was straight away using clay and plaster because they were free at art school. And then they just stuck. Like I love the fact that they're super accessible, super cheap. I can get them in tons. So, I regularly use several tons of clay in my work. And I love the fact that I can have this very basic, extremely abundant material on earth. Plaster, also gypsum, is highly abundant anywhere I go. And that I can deal with extremely large volumes, which for me is really interesting when a material is so abundant that I literally can't handle it physically.
Do you have a ritual to start working?
Nowadays I do. I didn't used to, but I'm trying to do more structure in my life. So now I come into my studio and the first thing I do is I change. So I change clothes. And then I make tea. So that's like how I begin my day. And then I usually get on with what I have been already doing. So sometimes I'll just go straight into work on a sculpture. Or if I'm in a process of generating new things, then sometimes I'll read for a while. I read a lot and I write a lot. And then at that point I can start, for example, drawing or just literally sometimes I'll just like dance and move around the studio in a way that I'm trying to understand something about how I occupy and move through space.
Do you want to drink your tea right now?
Thank you.
What kind of experience are you looking for yourself when you're at work?
I want to feel very connected to what I'm doing. I think for me, like how something is done is equally as important as to what it is. So for me, the materials I use, the processes that I use, I see them all as part of the work. Like I know most people don't see those things, they just see the result. But for me, the entire process from the beginning to the end is part of the work. If I'm not somehow seeing that, then there's a problem. Like if I'm using a material that's like really toxic and I can't touch it and I have to wear gloves and masks all the time and I'm really disconnected from it and scared, then that's not good. I need to be really feeling that I'm engaged and feeling like there's a transference of information back and forth between me and what I'm doing, which usually for me involves touching. So I'm usually very physically active and touching and thinking through my hands as I'm working. I don't like to feel like there's a separation or some kind of really obvious hierarchy between me and the material. I like there to be this kind of back and forth where the material is informing me and I'm informing it. And clay and plaster are two materials that I've become very familiar with because I've worked with them for, over a decade now, very intensely. So it becomes a really rich conversation for me in that way. That I'm constantly discovering new things, and the materials are kind of informing what I do, as well as hopefully vice versa.
How can you control this interaction between the material and yourself?
I usually create very specific molds that I work into. So I often start with drawings, and then from those I build very large boxes made of wood. So there's a lot of carpentry that's involved. And then these boxes are often designed to contain me and contain the material. So it's containing both of us. And within this contained space, I can create this very alternative reality where myself and the material can almost exist on an equal footing. So in a way, the drawings are the answer to a question I had. I then move in a way that replicates those drawings as a choreography, and then create this environment where I'm moving in complete physical contact with the material. So it's almost like a dance partner within this very specific space.
Do you think that the viewer has to know something to appreciate your work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I like to think that, and I really hope that this happens with my work because I really believe it's important, that people can get a lot from it without knowing that it is something that stands and can stand its ground as a piece of good sculpture without the whole back information. I mean, I've had this argument with people like, you're not a conceptual artist. You are a conceptual artist. Because for me, the concept and the process is extremely important and intertwined, literally intertwined. So I think you can get a lot more from the work if you know how it's made, if you know what led to it. But I hope that it can stand on its own as well. And I like the initial experience of it to be just an object in a space that relates to you physically, and then that the story unfolds.
The simple interaction is not that simple.
Yeah, you're right. It's not that simple. I think that the work is for me, a good piece of art has to be sort of like something that kind of sucks you in. So it has to have this action of, you see an object and it's in some way mysterious enough that you want to find out more about it, that you want to find out the stories behind it. So I think any good art has that. If an object is completely resolved independently as its own thing, then generally speaking, it's probably not good art. It's probably such a one-liner as a thing that it's flat. And I think in order to make an object that's three-dimensional in terms of not just physically, but like emotionally, conceptually, temporally, it has to be mysterious. There needs to be a mystery to it.
It's about emotion.
Yeah, there's an emotional component that I hope people get from the work. I mean, I think that's how people react to my work immediately, because they see that there's a physical interaction, even if it's not immediately obvious. There's something about the dimensions, there's something about the detail that reveals that this was very heavily worked by a body, that I think strikes this notion of like a physical empathy that's almost subliminal. It's almost like below conscious, that then can kind of help pull the threads of, bringing people into wondering how the work was made.
What kind of experience do you want to offer to the viewers?
I think as a sculptor, I think in terms of very long time. So, for example, when I make an object, I want it to last thousands of years. That's the ideal for me. And I think as a woman, as someone from South America, like I feel like I want to insert a different voice into history. Sculpture has an inherent relationship to history. It's, archaeology. Like, what are we digging up? They're objects. They're things that people made. So this is how we construct the past of reality. And I think that when I think of what I want people to get from it, it's more this idea that there's maybe an alternative history or an alternative way of thinking about reality that's being made with these objects, like actively generated by these objects.
It's about imprint.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of imprinting of my body in the work. And what I hope that the work does, the forms that are there aren't immediately recognizably a body though, right? They're very strange looking, often quite alien, or they're more determined by a body as an active agent that's able to make and form space around itself than trying to represent a body. So in a way, I hope that I can, through that, create a representation of a reality that defines a human being as an agent. And I think as a woman and as a woman from South America, for me, that's very important to insert that into the history of art. And also to perhaps with these objects create an alternative version of what is reality that sort of can withstand and survive into the future.
When you're at work, how do you know that the piece you're working on is finished?
Generally, for me, it's very obvious because my work is so process-based that the end is already built into the beginning. Like there is no adding or subtracting. It's just done. Because it's almost like choreographed action. I know when it's going to end. So, I'll complete a task. That's it. But there is also the element of making it physically able to stand up on its own. So for me, the ending becomes much more about when the piece is strong enough that I can take it out of a mold. It has enough steel or material embedded in it. It's more practical than conceptual.
Did you notice from piece to piece any continuity in your work?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like there's certain themes that kind of return. And in a way, sometimes I'll forget about them and then they'll just reappear. Like I'll realize I'm doing something that I had done 10 years ago, but in a different way. And I'm like, oh, there's still a little bug of that idea is obviously still in my head and returns and returns and returns. So there's definitely that. And then there's the formal aspects of it, which is that because my body is usually inside the work while it's being made, that there are all these markers of my height, my width, my, all these elements that are constantly present. And that for me has been really interesting to observe how they change gradually as I age as well. So, my body doesn't look the same as it did 10, 15 years ago. And then seeing that in the imprints I leave behind in the work for me has become almost really beautiful to see that.
You come from Brazil. Is there any specific New York spirit for you?
Yeah, definitely. I kind of always thought I would end up here in a weird way. It wasn't planned. I had to leave England because of the visa system that I was on changing. So I was basically just ended up coming to New York. I think that New York's a good place to get kicked in the butt, I think coming here is not easy. And for me, it was, my work was doing quite well in the UK. I was, showing in some major spaces and then arriving in New York and finding myself, I'm suddenly a waitress and I have no job and that, I used to teach and, can barely afford a studio. It was really kind of like having someone shake you. And I think it was actually very good now in retrospect for me to have that because it sort of shifted everything. And I think that's how I feel about the spirit of New York. It has a good quality of kind of kicking you in the butt.
I'm gonna leave the space, keep the microphone, and add whatever you want to the interview.
Oh. Okay. I don't know. Maybe I'll talk about what's going on right now. I think that for the first time in my life, I can see the next 2 years of my life completely planned out. So it's one show, and then another show, and then another show. And I feel suddenly this sort of rigidity of almost like a tantalizingly close feeling of yes, I've done it. Now I have all these shows lined up, and it's going to be wonderful. But then also this feeling of knowing that my entire next 2 years of life are probably preset with very little space for anything new or any kind of experimentation, that it's mostly going to be research delivery of new sculpture. And it's a strange feeling. I'm kind of feeling a little bit corralled by the art world and what it means. So you make something as an artist, you make it in your studio, you have a relationship with that form, that object, that idea. And then it goes out into the world, and that means it goes into a commercial gallery or a nonprofit space or a collector's home, and minimal people get to see it, generally. And that's it. And suddenly, I think as an artist, that feels like that's not enough at all. So I'm starting to try and think outside of the constraints of what people refer to as the art world, and have started to propose projects to spaces that wouldn't normally exhibit contemporary art. So I'm kind of trying to put my work into anthropological and archaeological museums. That's what I'm trying to do right now, which has led to some interesting conversations and, a lot of research and proposals to try and do that.